Hello and welcome back to the third day, session 2, which, as you know, has involved some juggling with the timetable, because we had to shift one of the speakers, one of the conversations, to after lunch. So now, just to run through the basic timetable, now until around 3:15, Mihnea and Piotr will conduct their conversation, and then we will immediately go into Nuria and Anna Longoni, who are here, and then we will have a coffee break. So that will be 2 sessions and then a coffee break, and then we'll come back for Douglas Gordon, and I have, with great sadness to report that Claire Bishop is not available today. She's stuck in Wales. So, unfortunately, I will have to take over, I'm afraid, and have a conversation with Douglas, but I promise to leave Douglas with much more of the words than me. And then finally, we'll have a plenary session, which I hope we can refer not only to the conversations that happened today and return to some of the issues that came up this morning, but also look at over the 3 days, finally, and then Maria will make some closing remarks, trying to, of course, it's impossible to bring things together, but trying to say what the subsequent steps are, I think, from here through until our final destination. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our 2 speakers. Nearest to me, Mihnea Mircan is an independent curator and writer. From 2005 to 2006, he was curator of Le Pavillon in the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and he is currently at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest. No. Sorry, no. He's not currently. He is at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest. Mircan has curated exhibitions.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Oh, sorry. Such as Sean Snyder. Is this your biography or is it somebody else's?
Everybody has met Sean one way or another.
Okay, good. And video works by Jan Tumik and Under Destruction, a series of site-specific interventions. Other recent curatorial projects by Mihnea include Since We Last Spoke About Monuments, which was in Den Haag, in this country, in last year, and Low-Budget Monuments in the 52nd Venice Biennale Romanian Pavilion. He has written for various monographs and art magazines, including Bach's recent publication of Mona Vanamatu Manu and Florian Tudor. I'm really bad at Romanian. And he was also editor of the book Memosphere, Rethinking Monuments, which was published in 2007. Mircan lives and works in Bucharest. Piotr Piotrowski, who's sitting next to him, is professor of modern art at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and since August 2009, so for a couple of months, he's been director of the National Museum in Warsaw. Piotr is also a former West researcher. He has been a visiting professor and fellow at many institutions, including the Clark Art Institute in the United States, the Collegium Budapest in Budapest, and the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in America. Piotr advised and co-organized a number of key exhibitions and projects in our period, 89 onwards, including 2000 plus, the Art from Eastern Europe in Dialogue with the West at the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana in 2000, and has written extensively on Central European art and culture. His latest books are Avant-Garde in the Shadow of Yalta, Art in Central Eastern Europe, 45 to 89, and Art After Politics. Piotrowski lives and works in Poznan and Warsaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles, for introduction. And thank you, Maria and Charles, for inviting me for this meeting. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it looks like former East European section, and this is maybe striking and quite significant that we are talking about the former West. Actually, this is maybe, sign of new times coming. And I'd like to begin from the end of my short speech concerning the project Former West in Madrid last June, or June actually. And when I said at that time that Former West does not necessarily mean that the West is over, of course. Rather, it means provincializing the West. So this is something connected to what you said, but I'm not going to say about provincializing Europe, but rather provincializing the West. So that was my conclusion in the former Togo, the former West, in Madrid. So the West, in that prospect, should be perceived as one of the provinces, as one among other provinces, such as, for example, former East. In other words, the West should not be recognized in this perspective as the center of the world, which was the idea of the modernist universalism, rather as one of the others, equal to the others. Of course, using this metaphor, provincializing the West, brings, of course, in mind the title of Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, which also has been mentioned before in today's series of talks. And this book is bringing as a point of reference the post-colonial studies. This would be the right place to discuss briefly at the beginning the question how we can use the post-colonial studies or post-colonial perspective in the post-communist studies of post-Cold War studies, which is the post-Cold War studies of post-communist studies, the right point of departure of the whole present project, since the subtitle of this series of conversations and papers is about the impact of the events of the 1989 to the whole structure. Let me say that I completely agree with Okui and Enwensor's statement that it does not necessarily mean changes in Europe, or particularly not Eastern Europe. It's a very broad changes coming together along this year. So the question is how we can use this, how we can use this particular post-colonial studies to the post-communist studies. And I would say at the beginning that I rather doubt this is not so easy. Why? Because comparing the post-colonial studies and the post-communist studies, if we compare those two, we are talking about two different historical situations and different historical experience, actually. There's also a problem with the cultural colonization, a question, who is the colonizer, who was the colonizer, and who was or is colonized. Why in the case of the post-colonial world, we know who was who. I'm not sure we know that in Eastern Europe we know this. Well, of course, we can agree that in terms of politics, the Soviet Union was a colonizer in Central Europe, but we cannot say, however, the same, that the Soviet culture had been colonizing Central European art and culture too. It was, of course, in terms of socialist realism, but this sort of art, first, worked in a couple of countries for a very short period only. Secondly, it had no prestige or symbolic capital, also very often among the members of the communist parties. The communist officials very often neglected this sort of art, at least for the long period. So, if the point of departure of the former West project is the political changes around 1989, the post-colonial prospect seems to be less important, that this comes directly from the issue. As a result, provincializing the West in terms of the 1989 perspective could be seen from a different perspective, namely from the, let's say, post-totalitarian one. In order to globalize this prospect, post-totalitarian prospect, let me say that the post-authoritarian perspective does not apply to the former East only, but could be also used in other regions, such as South Africa, which also has been mentioned by Charles, South America, for example, where many countries have been liberated from the local authoritarian regimes almost at the same time, like Argentina, Brazil, or Chile. This is a question of globalizing the year 1989. This is historically much better context than the post-colonial prospect. Of course, I'm not going to ignore post-colonial studies as one of the factors in the discussion of the former West. I'm just going to say that there are other ones, post-authoritarian, which are closer to the 1989 problem than the post-colonial methodology. Finally, it gives us a global perspective for the 1989 question. So I would say that we can cut historically, or let's say horizontally, post-authoritarian mood or structure, not necessarily touch at the same time post-colonial vocabulary, because this is, much more historically speaking, in my opinion, a proper context. The next question I'd like to raise here is a shift from geography of art to the topography of art. While the first framework, geography of art, applies to the countries, quite typical for the Cold War period based on the binary East-West relations. The latter, topography of art, or topography of culture, operates with places, with cities. In other words, the nation-state relations are replaced by metropolitan relations. London does not necessarily mean British, as well as Berlin does not necessarily mean German, or Moscow, Russian, New York, American, Mexico City, Mexican, Mumbai, Hindu, Tokyo, Japanese, and so on, and so on, and so on. Of course, the metropolis is not necessarily Western, and this is a sort of important perspective. What's more, even if they are in the West, culturally speaking, they are very often more cosmopolitan than national, the metropolis. You can keep in mind that the word cosmopolitan comes from Greek, cosmopolis, the cities which are at the same time universal, or definitely not national. It's not necessarily international. Cosmopolitan is something different than international, and maybe is something different also than transnational. Coming back to the issue, to the main topic of a series of talks on institutions in the framework of the former West project. This is the real, so I'm trying to fulfill the expectations that we have to talk about not exhibitions, not necessary exhibitions, but institutions. Right? So coming back to the main issue. I remember very clearly what the director of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor, once said that about his collections. Although those collections have been created under the umbrella of British imperialism, British Museum, now in this cosmopolitan city, MacGregor said, they are working as a project, as a point of departure for multi-ethnic identity. Is that true or not? This is a different question. But he said he just created his institution identity as such, working for the multinational cosmopolitan audience. This is, I think, quite striking for the former West situation. Post-imperial West, for provincializing the West, this statement is quite striking for provincializing the West. Finally, this is a question of the museum. So I'd like to talk about the museum, which has shifted from the national one to the cosmopolitan one. If the national museums are symptomatic for Western culture by their origins, the cosmopolitan ones are fitted more to the post-Western, which indeed are global. As I have mentioned before, a series of today's talks is concentrated on institutions in the framework of the former West. Now I'd like to speak particularly on this institution, and particularly on the institution which is called Universal Survey Museums. This is from Duncan and Wallach. Historical interpretation of the key museums in the West. This sort of museum, Universal Survey Museum, is typical Western institution. Speaking about the former West does not mean that that we have to remove, of course, museums from the former West societies. On the contrary, since we do not speak about the former West in terms of that is over, rather in terms that its position is different, provincialized the museums. It means that we should rethink the role of this sort of museum, the Universal Survey Museum. The museum has been founded as the opening of the art or artifacts collection to the public in the framework of the Enlightenment and at the same time emerging modern European democracies in the 18th century. However, the latter had been understood as the national rather than the multicultural society. Now, in the face of cosmopolitan relations, in the face of creating a new global citizenship, the museum also should change its position from the national to the global one. Generally speaking, the museum works between a couple of different points of reference. First, the power, the state and local administration, which is very often, particularly in the former Eastern Europe, quite powerful still, much more powerful in terms of the museums than those in the former West. So that's the first. The second, the new audience, connected with the worldwide tourism on the one hand, but still the local museum, the local audience. We should keep in mind that still the local audience is so important for the museums, as, for example, Hans Belting, when I would be referring to him, pointed out. And the third, the corporate and private sponsorships, as well as the market, imported because of possible financial support given to the museums. Playing game between those 3 points of reference, being received by the new audience quite cosmopolitan or somehow cosmopolitan, particularly in the former West, in the East maybe, in the former East, let's say, this audience is not necessarily cosmopolitan, what is also should be also a topic of the discussion. So located in the different city structures, not national, but indeed cosmopolitan, working in the framework of topography rather than geography of culture, the new museum, or the new role of the museum, is facing a new challenge. This implies a new profile of the museum. I would say that the museum should be a critical institution, an active participant in social and political processes, particularly those which support a sort of new cosmopolitan or at least multicultural democracy. Of course, the museum can use a tradition of a critical theory, which is, of course, the Western tradition par excellence. They can use this tradition of a critical theory. This is why I would call this process from a critique of the institution to the critical institution. That would also be a sort of escape from a critical theory to the critical practice. Now there's a question. If international relationships between nations are replaced by intercosmopolitan relationships, so if we've been talking about, modernist culture, we had international relationships. Now, if we talk about cosmopolitan culture, we have to talk about the intercosmopolitan relationships between places or between cities which are going to be cosmopolitan in character. The question would be what kind of role of the museum should play in such a new situation in the inter-province structure. So if we are talking about provincializing the West, and if we talk about that the West is one of the provinces, and keeping in mind that is the global prospect, we have to talk about inter-provinces relationships. Such a structure is, of course, global, so the question would be on the global dimension of the former, let's say in brackets, former Western museums. The problem with globalization is with the, as we know, of course, is its economic character, or it's based on the economic. It means that whereas the capital is global, its control, the control of the capital by the people is limited. Since the control mechanisms are local, namely limited to the nation-state legal and political structures. The real problem is that there is no global politeia. At the same time, we need something in order to control the capital. We need something like a global politeia, a global political constitution, global political sphere. If museums created or helped to create civic societies, or if they were one of the factors building civic societies in the West, understood in the national framework, now, in the context of the former West condition, they could be the same, but on the global way. This is the sphere where the cosmopolitan critical museum could work, and this is why to create a global politeia should be its main task. We, of course, know that the museums are global, and they would like to do global politics. Up to today's experience, however, is problematic. Let's take into consideration the Guggenheim global policy run by Thomas Kranz, its former director. It had definitely nothing to do with politeia. The same we can say, we can ask about the Louvre and its potential presence in Abu Dhabi, along with Guggenheim. Strong and severe public debate in France was not exactly about that the Louvre would lose the opportunity to create a global politeia. Rather, it would lose a national, means French heritage, or it would sell it. Jean Clair called the situation the crisis of the museum. On the other hand, what he did not stress is that such a cultural globalization is petrifying the West, understood as a cultural center, its cultural hegemony, which has nothing to do with its provincializing. It's going along with the economic expansion of the international capital, but not with its critique, as many ultra-globalist movements or organizations do. It has nothing to do with ultra-globalization, understood as a critique of economic globalization. In one word, both the Louvre and Guggenheim global policy has nothing to do with the critical character of the museum, and as such, it would be very difficult to see them as the examples of the former West situation. The possible answer for globalization seems to be given by the Museum of Contemporary Art, MOCAS, as Hans Belting pointed out recently in the book which was published this year, I guess. They are replacing museums of modern art, MoMAs, typical for Western modernist universalism. The shift from MoMA to MOCA, still referring to Hans Belting, is very striking. First of all, they are not necessarily built for exhibiting art history in terms of a classical understanding of the world. If art is around MOCA at all, this is rather the so-called global art or contemporary art, I'm still referring to belting. We can understand the difference between those two models, MoMA and MoCA, by taking into consideration the modernist duality between art history on the one hand and ethnology on the other. While the first has been designed by art museums and identified by art forms only without any subject matter references, having its own autonomous history, the second one was located in ethnographic museum, to which, on the contrary, a subject matter was definitely more important than the form, which used to be transparent, if not neglected. The global world, also art world, abolished this duality, still referring this article, the Belting's article. For contemporary art and museum, a subject matter, not a form, seems to be important, or definitely not an autonomous form operated by classical art history. Respectively, for contemporary, former, with a question mark, Western artists to be placed in a proper position in classical art historical narratives seems to be less important than to create a social or political message, including his or her identity. And on the other hand, non-Western artists are at the same time trying to leave the ethnic label given by ethnography in order to submit some messages, political as well, geographical, for example, or psychological. MoCA is a product of those processes. If we add other points of departure typical for globalization, such as media, pop culture, art market, and so on, we will have a real picture of a global contemporary art, at the same time a real picture of MoCA. The real problem, however, is as well. It's a question how global art, and MoCA in particular, can be critical, or could be critical. At the same time, how it could create a world politeia. Boris Groys, analyzing biennials, is saying that the role of this worldwide institution is something like that, if I correct you, if I remember you correctly. I had no access to your paper about biennials in Warsaw, so maybe it's not correct. But as far as I remember, biennials tracing the global capital are trying to create a global political discourse. It could be, but not necessarily is, a critical voice to globalization, and along with a critical contribution to the power of global capital. But the question, however, is of the museum, particularly of the so-called, as I said before, universal survey museum, typical Western institutions. So not MoCA, not biennials, even not exhibitions, but the question will be about this particular museum. If we'd like to talk about former West, we have to consider this typical Western museums and its position. Unfortunately, I have no answer for this question, no positive answer for this question. The only thing I can say today is that if provincializing the West, and at the same time the diagnosis that the West is former is correct, it means that the museum strategies should not be global only, but particularly they should be critical as well. So let me remind once more that I'm talking about this particular institution. So maybe this is not the conclusion, but just the open question that since up till now I do not find, or we do not find, any clear and convincing examples that this sort of museum are playing critical role, this sort of museum, so the Universal Survey Museum, so to be still at the former West situation, maybe this question is still open. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello. For my part, I will look at 2 points of intersection between post-communism and post-colonialism. 2 folds in a colonial equation that remains to be mapped out. 2 scenarios of otherness that the East of Europe enacts, and the museologies that would correspond to them. I should say that I'm using the term museology in a sense that was developed by Donald Preziosi as an allomorph of art history, a cited set of practices and protocols, but not necessarily cited in the museum. The first text that I wish to invoke is Alexander Kiosev's 1998 Notes on Self-Colonizing Cultures. Kiosev's East is absorbed by its own marginality. Like Achilles, it is logically, structurally incapable of catching up with the turtle. The East, according to Kiosev, attempts to constitute its identity in relation to what it lacks fundamentally. He says, in the genealogical knot of the Bulgarian national culture, there exists the morbid consciousness of an absence, a total, structural, non-empirical absence. The others, the neighbors, Europe, the civilized world, possess all that we lack. They are all that we are not. The identity of this culture is initially marked and even constituted by the pain, the shame, the trauma of this global absence. The origin of this culture arises as a painful presence of absences, and its history could be narrated, in short, as centuries-old efforts to make up for and eliminate the traumatic shortages, end quote. Kiosev speaks of a morbid model of civilization evenly spread across Eastern cultures, a constitutive absence which translates into shame, the systematic import of models, and painstaking self-colonization. Eastern European cultures narrate themselves from the second half of the 19th century onwards, I would say, as not central, not timely, and not big enough, European, but perhaps not to a real extent, but also as insufficiently alien, not distant and not backward enough to be relegated to an entirely different paradigm of representation. They portray themselves as commensurate and inadequate at the same time. Therefore, we are not others, they say. We are not our own other, the radiant model, which is situated elsewhere, but also we are not this other's other. We are just its incomplete self. As Kiosev remarks, what informs and propels this is, of course, a theological model, but one with an alien civilization in the structural place where transcendence used to be. The alien is the universal is forever alien, which results in a disempowering alterity and a doctrine of cardinal points. It's perhaps important to note that this is actually not an exit from modernity, but its core engine in reverse drive. It's a perfectly modern act of self-definition made to implode by delegating the legitimacy of this definition. Finally, these cultures write for themselves a history which evacuates them, or where inscription is simultaneous with exclusion. I find let's say the archaeology that Kiosev does for his own concept problematic and in need of nuances, but I will not go into details. I'll just mention that at the origin of this self-colonization there seems to be nothing. They arise from a vacuum. In turn, at the other end, at the other extreme of the process, they seem to quite easily engender the Sturm und Drang of nationalism as a perverse byproduct. There is in the East, Kiosev notes, a susceptibility of these cultures to embrace any providential ideology that could come to their rescue and furnish them with a sense of primacy or exceptionality. One artistic answer to Kiosev's question comes from Bulgaria, but with a significant detour through Vienna. Plamen Dejanov's Planets of Comparison, the project that I will discuss briefly, it can be explored in terms of over-identification, which is a term that Piotr uses a little bit in the shadow of Yalta, especially in relation to the Slovenian group Irvin. But it can, of course, be also discussed in terms of an over-identification, therefore complicity. I realized that the mere mention of Plamen's name can sort of generate an anti-liberal frisson, so I think a substantial caveat is in order. Dejanov infamously turned a gallery space into a perfectly functional BMW showroom, changed his name from the Bulgarian and poor Dejanov to Dejanov, over-designed his artistic persona, held his Palais de Tokyo exhibition not in Palais de Tokyo but in his sumptuous Berlin studio, and generally crisscrossed quite nonchalantly between art and life, the latter understood as an accelerated channel of marketing, and the former as the purity and transparency of exchange value. I would argue that planets of comparison stand somewhat apart. The artist bought 7 houses in the center of Veliko Trnovo, which is a small town in northern Bulgaria, and the proposal was to convert these 7 houses into spaces for exhibiting contemporary art, to be used by partner international museums as branches for either their collections or outposts for their project spaces. In the first phase of the project, the Viennese MUMOC acquired the villa and did set up a medium-term exhibition project for the space. Other museums from other geographies and ideologies were supposed to follow. It didn't work, but I believe it's profitable to imagine nonetheless what it could have achieved, to map out the project obviously without purging it of its duck-rabbit directionality. Planet is self-colonization materialized, paradoxically materialized as quasi-presence, as a question, but also a site where institutions would have been forced to recalibrate their positions, negotiate with audiences and each other, far from the safety of known territory and unproblematic positions, in relation to a new public and a potentially startling set of problems. They would have had to negotiate and sustain their own legitimacy, no longer handed to them by either tradition, social consent, or corporate sponsors. And in a sense, I think the project, Planets of Comparison, left it up to these participating institutions whether this negotiation would be carried out in new terms or by resorting to old tropes of predominance, however those are articulated in the work of museums. Participation to the project would have been, to a large extent, conditioned by the institution's own rhetoric about institutional flexibility and cross-cultural dialogue. Refusal to embark upon the project, which was elegantly yet vigorously twisting their respective arms and institutional limbs, would have falsified their ideology of openness. At the other end, the project brought home a model of overdevelopment, of cultural saturation. Ironically, perhaps stating that this is what the East needed, wanted, without actually voicing this desire. From this realization of mutual phantasms, or from a matrix incorporating visions, chunks of history, particularities and globalities, distrust and emulation, site-specificity and universalism, emerges an image of the museum which is, in the sense of Clement Greenberg, more firmly entrenched in its area of competence, although in this case this seems to be primarily neoliberalism and a financial medium. As well as a strategy of the peripheral, which is significantly different from yet another biennial, which would have been perfectly feasible in Veliko Trnovo, but in a sense of an appropriate comparison, I think, is one between parachuting a load of humanitarian aid, the biennial, as opposed to a more complex Marshall Plan for the collective imaginary that Planets of Comparison, in a sense, proposes. As another aside, I would compare Planets of Comparison, but perhaps there's no time to do that in detail, with Thomas Hirnschorn's Musée Précaire, which also corresponded in a sense to a formative function that is inscribed in Centre Pompidou's policy without being necessarily acted upon. The suburb, which is colonized in a sense in Hirnschorn's project, is a part of Pompidou's target audience, but it's also its gray zone, it's its blind spot that the project sort of visualized in the reversal that it proposed. As opposed to musée précaire, planets reproduces elsewhere, the expansion is drive of the institution. By this elsewhere, I mean, of course, a certain geographical and ideological distance. By superimposing this expansionist drive on the map of an unknown territory. I will not dwell too much on globalization because it has been done quite luminously already. I would just remark in passing that the art world has responded to contemporary geopolitics largely through representations of the global, seeing itself as distinct from the real world, like a figure against the ground. As opposed to that, and it's a final point in my sort of apology for planets of comparison, I would describe it as a geographical machine, as a topocritical experiment that produces a kind of neoliberalism purified, detached from commercial necessity, and where financial dependencies are exhibited in as much as they are played out. I think this qualifies as a life-size version of globalization rather than an image of globalization. If nothing else, it's a comment on how globalization and post-communism complicate each other. Planets of comparison suggest the impossibility of construing the East and the liberating anticlimax in the discourse of gaps and divisions. It disorients the East. The East is permeated by West as well as by a non-East, which is, it either gesticulates or is interlocked with a non-West. And it's through this tension and relationship that they could potentially define each other. It brings the West to the East in an act which is neither import nor export, neither colonization nor self-colonization, finally, or a mode of colonization where it ceases to be clear who is colonizing who and why, or via which the colonization has already a sort of a counter-reaction in place, inscribed already in the colony. It creates something that I would call an apotheosis of separate insufficiencies. The 7 institutions that were supposed to constitute the project, they articulate a frame, an aggregate of methods, protocols, social ritual, and systems of circulation, a machinery for sustaining a central truth, delineating a void made so palpable so as to appear solid. I'll move on now to another institution, perhaps as venerable, well, certainly as venerable as the museum, the institution of art history that I think is being increasingly mentioned in institutional critique contexts as possibly the main target of a potential third wave of institutional critique. I will look at present and future avatars of art history, but not in order to invoke an art history to come from the East, sort of a compensated psychoanalytically version of the texts, of art historical text, where Eastern European artists finally find the description they deserve in a reconfigured canon. Rather a reflection on the formation and resilience of canons, on the possibility of an art history that dispenses with them. I'm sorry. The departing point could be this ambiguity. Are we, and by we I mean, of course, thank you very much, Piotr.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Excuse me, just 1 second. Are we people operating in and out contemporary art in art history? Therefore, is art history the exact sum of the discourses that reference it or that gesture towards it? Catalogs, conferences, press releases, biennials. Do these gestures and discourses determine the discipline's center, periphery, borders, and wastelands? Therefore, is art history an interpretive grid in the process of being articulated and calibrated through artistic practices and theoretical negotiations? Or is it the recurring phantasm of a text that will one day make definitive sense of what we're going through artistically today? The authority and disciplinary confidence of art history is perhaps being disputed today between 3 theoretically coextensive modes of enunciation. A default art history informs blockbuster exhibitions, is taught in some schools and popularized in great masters' books or films. It links artists, styles, and historiographic data in an epistemological vacuum. It flows without interruption or anxiety since the times of Giorgio Vasari and demonstrates a course of history in the mirror of art. Another avatar of art history contends with both the first instance and the end of history. With the disintegration of internal logic and self-sufficiency in the discipline, it tries to resituate the evolution of art and the ramifications of its questions after the presumed halt of history, to situate Hegel after Danto, to remap the connections between art and an incompletely evacuated historicism. The critique of constructed symmetries and hegemonic exclusions in traditional art history engenders, on this particular analytic stage, series of prologues to several histories that would, were they ever written, dispense with chronologic confabulation and mutations of style. Non-histories both informed and incapacitated by strands of theoretical thought originating elsewhere in the humanities. I believe a third replica of the lost art historical original is to be found in contemporary art's own avid relation to what it sometimes perceives as its own adolescence, sometimes as a vanishing point for its own uncertainties and desire of legitimacy. It's also to be found in its determination to have a history, even if premised on doubtful foundations and perfect malleability. There has been a tremendous amount of talk about this, so I'll just quickly mention that a chronic historiographic compulsion is arguably the defining feature of today's art, with the inbuilt contradictions of a particular understanding of modernism as prime object of historical desire. The past this kind of contemporary art portrays, to me, it reads like a series of quirks and blips of historiographic time against a background of grand narratives relentlessly realizing themselves. This art history is both the site of futures unrealized, unjust, or captive to political winners, and at the same time the problematic lineage from which contemporary art would like to portray itself as descending. From these interrelated perspectives, I would say that art history operates today in the growing chasm between the contemporary, with its fatigue, diversities, and archaeological disposition, and the non-familiar, if not impervious, past. Perhaps it operates in a former disciplinary topography, half-excavated and turned into a museum for the fragments of a discursive apparatus, instruments of connoisseurship, iconography or social history, absented categories, and the weathered totems of ancestors. The transition might be here a little brutal, but my question as a turning point in what I'm proposing is how would all this apply to the East? A territory which is traversed, as we know, by so many shifts and spasms, by a surplus of history. Winston Churchill quite famously remarked that Eastern Europe produces more history than it can consume. So there is a surplus of history that sort of haunts that part of the world. It's a place where history meanders, betrays and eludes its subjects. And finally, for our current purposes, a territory where the angel of art history, if indeed there is an angel of art history, zigzags or encounters so many obstructions that it is pushed back into the past, eyes directed menacingly towards the future. I'm coming now to the second colonial fold, which I announced in the beginning, discussed in an interesting text called In the Boots of Communism by Boris Budin. The text is written in 2005 and it was published in an anthology which I think was co-edited by Boris Budin and Boris Groys. Budin takes a cue from Homi Bhabha's discussion of the fetish and extends it to the historiographic ambiguities of post-communism, essentially arguing that post-communism colonizes its past. This second colonial fold consists in a systematic return to an adversary that has been definitively indicted and in the obsessive repetition of a definitive verdict. Post-communism's anti-communism is not a political conviction proper, Boudin remarks, because this would place it in an actual, complicated, ongoing political dispute and would presuppose the actuality of that adversary, armed with a counter-discourse. Instead, a little bit like an amputated comparison, post-communism is a non-discourse, a form of knowledge which is arrested and rigid, to be activated and reproduced only in fetishistic stereotypes, a mix of fascination and anxiety, where the East averts its eyes from the past while being immobilized by it. It separates itself from an object of desire and abhorrence that it construes temporarily, as opposed to the sort of regular colonial operation of construing this object of desire and abhorrence spatially. Communism and post-communism function as each other's implacable and empty revisionism. They disrupt the syntax of each other's position. Communism does not adhere to post-communism as its prologue, and post-communism does not proceed from communism as its necessary confirmation. This refusal to negotiate critically the communist past, along with the history and transitionality of the last 2 decades, which saw immense shifts in the creation of new regimes of truth and legality, is as brutal a historiographic cut as the communist portrayal of the Golden Age itself. In a sense, it's a historiographic cut which seems to be reproducing itself after '89. Communism is seen today as distant, identical to itself, monstrous in both senses of the word, and not ours, without defining neither the primal sin of this dispossession nor the communality to which communism is not admitted. I'm sort of slowly and painfully making my way to the idea of museology, of an Eastern museology, the foundation, or maybe what to put at the foundation of the foundation, how to begin to think about an archive of Eastern museology. Thinking and speaking of archives, I think we're, and I do this with the utmost respect for Charles Merriweather's recent anthology at Whitechapel. I think we are necessarily situated between two models. One model of the archival deployed a particular kind of modernist ideology and constituted a social and epistemological technology to conceive and maintain modern identities and the political entities these identities supported and justified. This first model of the archive is a vast mechanism of inclusions and exclusions whose purpose is to make from the present the demonstrable product of a particular past, so that the past stage in that way might be framed as an object of historical desire, figured as that from which a modern citizen might desire descent. Contemporary art has, dealing directly or not with archives, I think has done quite a lot to ramify this particular epistemological script. Thinking about the East and archives, I think there's a second model that suggests itself, an older one, one with a singular status. I'm thinking about the Library of Alexandria. It has the singular status of an institution in which the conservation and destruction of tradition can hardly be told apart. An archive that, in a vertiginous moment of self-abolition, threatens to coincide entirely with its own destruction. I'm following here the analysis of Daniel Heller-Rosen, discusses in some detail how the Ptolemaic archive was initially constructed and how its legendary destruction has been forged. The primary act of inscription, of course, the very attempt to conserve the past, alters it forever. The moment when each work was recorded on the tablets in the Alexandrian Index, each work was inevitably set in a new and foreshortened shape, indicated by a title that would henceforth name it, attribute it, identify it, transform it into a cipher, a mere name for itself, figured onto a screen. Perhaps, yeah. The index, in a sense, is a miniature archive within the larger archive, where texts are remembered in being dismembered, placed in a history of letters by being extricated from the fabric of their own production, summoned as emblems. The second level of destruction that the text I quoted mentions is the forgery, forging books and titles that, in exchange of large financial gains, would enter the library of Alexandria. And finally, and more importantly, there's the perjury about the destruction of the library, the trope of the catastrophe, which is, to a certain extent, 2 minutes. Oh my God.
2 minutes, 2 pages.
Yeah, no, I've actually got... Yeah, I think I can do it. I'll just... It will just fall apart, I think, if I... have to be very careful with this. Of course, historical scholarship has substantially revised the idea that the Library of Alexandria indeed burned, but and suggests instead that the real destruction was negligible. Real or imagined, though, the conflagration remains the supreme emblem of the archive itself, constituted and conserving its history in threatening it with destruction. I believe that in this double coding, the library sort of entrusts itself to present criticism. Possibly this recuperates an echo of the discussion between Boris Groys and Jalal Tufik. A quick answer out of this sort of polarity of possible models of the archival would be that the East aspired to the epistemologically rigorous first model and ended up with a second, with the archive as self-contestation, as self-abolition, as something that is incapable of inscription, that is removed the very second it is inscribed. It has been indexed as art from the East, therefore, filled in a sense with its own geographical residues, and it's been also indexed as not really art because to such an extent submerged in trauma and fratricide. I will not go into that because there's obviously no time. My contention is whether we can imagine an artistic object that is oriented to its own future historicization, as opposed to one that looks within art history for the sources of a dual, harmoniously comprehensive discourse or canon. The main job of art history is to reanimate and perpetually circumnavigate its foundational dilemma, transforming its own capta into data and trying to obscure what is essentially an ideological demonstration. How to make that whole set of processes and protocols work in tandem with a history without origin, or where origin is erasure and unbelonging. What to do with geographic residue, which resists incorporation in the Enlightenment dream of commensurability, or in which the commensurate can only be dreamt as a nightmare. In sort of the foundation of art history being a secular theologism for articulating congruities between subjects and their object worlds, and between objects with respect to their subjects. Finally, my contention is for objects articulating the visual and intellectual possibility of a canon that eschews the methods of traditional art history, takes advantage of the blind spots in new art history, and plays with the cultural need to be situated on a map and within the course of a history. This practice draws non-linear connections to our emergent past, confronting it with the timelines it permanently abandons or refashions, while engaging the art historian's muted preoccupation with the future, the moment when art ceases to be and the archive comes together complete, making sense of a present that does not adhere to the past as inexorable condition or to the future as necessity of confirmation. A present which comes up, an artistic present, which comes about through reciprocities between the object's conceptual protrusions and extensions, deregulations of the interpretive script, and modes of historiographic engagement. Final phrase, I promise. This proceeds from the belief that the only future available to art, the future that it can breach interpretatively, is neither futuristic nor futurological, not an allegory of technology or ecology, but it's the future understanding of art, it's the future of art history, and the extent to which works or practices indeed participate to their own interpretation, ask what forms interpretation could take and what these could lead to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You brilliantly avoided having to have a conversation with each other, which I respect enormously. I wonder if we can move on very rapidly and return to the next two speakers, and then we will return to these questions, and I hope people can bear in mind questions that they might want to refer to, or to Piotr or to Mihnea in the plenary session.